Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again for our third installment from our religion chapter. Tonight we are looking at ethnic religions. So very quickly, before we get started, go ahead and define for us, for your review, what is an ethnic religion? Because that's what all of the religions tonight have in common. Here we go. Let's get started with Hinduism, which is the world's third largest religion. Numbers somewhat disputed a little bit. Some say over a billion, some say under a billion. Regardless, right around a billion followers worldwide. Here is our definition. An ethnic religion, and one of the oldest religions in the modern world, and now dominant value system and religion in India. Closely identified with Indian culture, but without central creed, single doctrine, or religious organization. Dharma, which is customary duty and divine law, and caste are uniting elements. As we have done with universalizing religions, before we get started with all the different aspects of this religion, let's go ahead and understand the origins. And the origins for Hinduism are really kind of debated, disputed. Regardless, we're going back thousands of years. Some say about 2500 to 1500 BCE. That is before the Common Era, with not a single agreed upon founder of Hinduism. Some scholars will say that the origins actually date all the way back to the Indus Valley civilizations, and that the Aryans, when they came in bringing their Indo-European language, influenced kind of the direction of Hinduism. But some scholars will say that it's a blending of Aryan and Dravidian beliefs. And so there's a lot of disputes about Hinduism and its origin, not a lot of consensus on it. But here's what we do know. Here's the things that we absolutely need to know. As with most ethnic religions, it's focused on the physical environment. So the sacred sites, the holiest of sites, typically in Hinduism, are going to be tied to the physical environment of India. So the Ganges is a great example. I'm going to talk about it here in a couple of slides. As a sacred river, it is pure, it is divine. It cannot be sullied by us mere mortals. And so that's going to be important here in just a minute. And as with most ethnic religions, it is fairly concentrated. 97% of the world's Hindus live in India. So let's take a look at the major concepts here. So as far as Hinduism, there isn't, again, a lot of consensus about the practices and things like that. It's largely up to the individual. Now, here's where things get kind of tricky, because you'll notice that that as far as the definition is concerned, there wasn't mention of whether it's monotheistic, polytheistic, because even that topic is debated. Some will say that it's polytheistic because of the different deities or different forms of deities that constitute those different branches that you see there, Vishnu, Shiva, as far as different deities. However, the general consensus that I have been seeing, and I was actually just listening to a debate amongst a couple AP human geographers very recently, and that is that it is a monotheistic religion with different forms, that God takes different forms. So Brahman, the God, takes different forms of Vishnu, of Shiva. So multiple forms of a single deity. So it's really, really tough. I don't anticipate a question like that on the AP exam, simply because there's so much debate. But I believe the College Board's official stance on Hinduism is that it is polytheistic. So just to make it a little bit more confusing there, I believe that's the official position of the College Board. But I don't anticipate a question like that. It's too contentious an issue, I think, for them to try and simplify in a multiple choice question or something like that. As far as the major aspects, there are a couple different things. The holy text, the Vedas that you see there. Om, which is the symbol that you see in the upper right-hand corner, is discussed fairly extensively in the Vedas. And so it's kind of laid out what that is throughout the holy text, so kind of the link that exists there. One other really enduring element that we have to be familiar with, you saw it in the definition, is the caste system. And the caste system established 4 different castes, 4 different classes, so to speak. And you were born into a class, and that is the class that you remained in for your entire life. And so it defined society. It was a really big element. So here were the 4 classes. The top class were the priests. Then as you move down, you had the warriors, the craftsmen, and then finally on the bottom, the unskilled laborers. Now, each of these had their own distinctive Indian names, terms that were associated with them. And then outside of the caste system were the untouchables, as they were called. And as the name kind of implies, they were untouchable. There was no interacting. There was no mingling with them. All right. Now, this is important to understand because the concept of reincarnation and karma are really central to Hinduism, because the way that one's lived during their life impacted their reincarnation, whether they moved up or down within the caste system. And so if you lived your life and did what you were supposed to do and worked hard and all these different types of things, that was good karma, and that would be repaid in the next life when you were reincarnated, and you might have moved up in the caste system. And so there wasn't a lot of discussion about moving up within one's life, but it was doing what you were supposed to during this life, so that in the next life you would move up. And that if you didn't do what you were supposed to, then that was bad karma. You might move down in the caste system. And so this was a really important element of Indian culture, and to a certain extent, especially in rural areas, is still a fairly influential element of Indian culture. It is no longer formally in place, but it is something that may still exist in the minds of many Hindus in India. This is a fascinating article about Hinduism in India and its impact on the physical environment. And the title of the article is "The Ganges River is Dying Under the Weight of Modern India." And it talks about how cremation is a really important burial practice for Hindus. And many Hindus, because the Ganges River is sacred, in fact, it's called Mother Ganga, because it is sacred, many Hindus will want to have their ashes spread in the Ganges River. And so the author of this piece goes to India and is observing this. And at one point, he witnesses these boys bathing in the river. They're rinsing their mouth in the river, and quite literally feet away, the author can see a dead body floating in the Ganges River. And so it's a really interesting article from the perspective of believers and non-believers, adherents to a religion and people outside the religion. Because within the religion, the Ganges is sacred. It is pure. It cannot be sullied by mere mortal people. So if there's a dead body floating there, it doesn't matter because it's the sacred waters of the Ganges. But from an outsider's perspective, this is something where we could look and say, well, people could get sick. And in fact, the article talks about something like 80% of rural diseases stem from poor water supply coming from the Ganges River. And so it's a fascinating article. I wish that we had enough time to read it, but it's linked on my website, so I encourage you if you have the time. But right now, I just want you to pose some questions. Like, what questions do you have? How can religion be seen from different perspectives from someone who is a follower of that religion versus someone who isn't? And whether we're talking about Hinduism or any other religion, it's an interesting topic. Maybe a controversial topic, I will admit, but an interesting topic to think about. Alrighty, shifting gears now, we are going to take a look at Judaism. Here's your definition. A monotheistic ethnic religion based on the teachings of Abraham. According to Jewish teaching, Abraham and God have a covenant in which the Jews agree to worship only one God, and God agrees to protect his chosen people, the Jews. So, as always, let's begin with the origins, the background about Judaism. And this begins with Abraham. And Abraham moved to Canaan, which is how this area is referred to in the Bible or the Old Testament. It's a land in the eastern Mediterranean. All right, so take a look at the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern part of it. That's where we're talking about. And different terms for this were referred to as Canaan in the Bible, Palestine by the Romans, and where the modern state of Israel is. So Abraham moves there. As part of this first covenant, God promises to provide for his chosen people, the Jews, this land. Now, after a period of time, there's a series of conquests, and the Babylonians come in, they invade, and many Jews are forced to flee. Some of those Jews ended up in Egypt, where they were enslaved. Well, a second covenant comes about as Moses, a prophet for the Jews, leads the Jewish people out of slavery in Egypt, what is referred to as the Exodus, and leads them back to Canaan. Now, during this period of time of traveling back to Canaan, Moses goes up onto Mount Sinai, and it is there that he establishes the second covenant with God, where God gives the Jewish people a series of commandments, all right, rules to live by. And the 10 most important were then created into the 10 Commandments. But then the entire rules to live by became the Jewish holy text of the Torah. And it's important to note, we mention it in the definition, but Judaism is a monotheistic religion, and that differed quite dramatically from a lot of the polytheistic religions of that time. In fact, some scholars say that this is the oldest monotheistic religion. Well, moving forward in the origins of this, in year 70 of the Common Era, years are kind of debated. 70 to maybe like 135 are some of the years that I've seen. The Romans sacked Jerusalem. And this leads to what is known as the Jewish diaspora, the dispersal of Jews from their homeland in the eastern Mediterranean for nearly 2,000 years, until the year 1948, when the state of Israel is founded, established, and recognized. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the different components here. Distribution. This is a little bit different. So please put a star next to distribution, because typically ethnic religions are fairly concentrated. And Judaism is less so than typical ethnic religions. And largely the reason is because of the Jewish diaspora, because they were forced to disperse from their homeland, the hearth where it began and where it would typically have remained concentrated. It has a much more wide spatial distribution. And so globally, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 to 15 million Jews worldwide. And a third of that number live in Israel, a third live in the United States, and a third live basically everywhere else. And because this ethnic religion is more widely dispersed than most other ethnic religions, there are some additional vocabulary terms that we need to be familiar with that really only kind of apply to Judaism because of its unique history and unique spatial distribution. So here are a couple terms that we need to know. First one is ghetto. During the Middle Ages, a ghetto was a neighborhood in a city set up by law to be inhabited only by Jews. Now, the term is used to denote a section of a city in which members of any minority group live because of social, legal, or economic pressure. Then, the next term is Zionism, the movement to unite the Jewish people of the diaspora and to establish a national homeland for them in the Promised Land. So the question that I have for you based on that definition is, what is that national homeland called? Because the Zionist movement pushed for the creation of a Jewish state. And in 1948, that goal was realized. And so what do we call that state? Okay. Now, as far as major aspects that we should be familiar with, holy texts, there are two, really one, and then commentary on it, which is part of it, still considered sacred. The Torah includes those 10 commandments as well as the 5 books associated with Moses and the origins of the Jewish people. And that is the Torah. It should be noted as well, since we mentioned it in the last lecture, that the Torah represents most of what is the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. In addition to this, the Talmud is the explanation of the Torah. It is religious commentary on the Torah by Jewish religious scholars, and it has since become holy text, sacred text. In addition to that, as far as symbols are concerned, the Star of David is a very recognizable symbol for Judaism throughout the world. And as far as architecture goes, synagogues are the typical place of worship and gathering for Jews worldwide. Our next ethnic religion is not really a religion, and that is Confucianism. Here's our definition. A Chinese value system. Notice, value system, not religion. Based on the writings of Confucius and emphasizing ethics, social morality, tradition, and ancestor worship. Right? As far as its origins, again, should be noted, not a religion. Not a religion. It's an ethical system. And so you might be wondering, okay, well, if it's not a religion, why are we talking about it in our religion unit? And the answer is because our definition of what a religion is, when people structure their lives according to ultimate priorities. Well, people still structure their lives according to the teachings of Confucius. So it fits there. There's not a deity, there's not an ultimate priority that you're working towards. So that's what separates this. It's an ethical system. It's a value system, an ideology, a belief system, not, however, a religion. And Confucius was a philosopher, he was a teacher, and stressed the importance of li, which is correct behavior or propriety, and ren, which is goodness or benevolence. And so some of the major practices, one that is especially prominent is orderly conduct. Right? And so that would be following traditions, fulfilling obligations that one has, and as well as treating others with respect. And in fact, there were 5 relationships that Confucius stressed the importance of. And those 5 relationships were father and son, elder brother and younger brother, husband and wife, older friend to younger friend, ruler to subject. Now, there's a couple of different things that we could point out with regards to this. One is that typically age is a factor here. Father to son, one is older, one is younger. There's deference. Elder brother to younger brother. The younger brother, paying respect to his elder brother. And also the importance of family. That's another important element. Father, son, brother and brother, husband and wife. Okay, so family is another important element of these 5 relationships and treating others with respect as part of that. Confucianism really is confined to China. And what makes this interesting is because it's not a religion, so to speak, it's a value system, people can be other things as well. People can be Confucianist as well as Buddhist. People can be Confucianist as well as Christian or Muslim. And so it's not mutually exclusive. It doesn't prohibit someone from participating in another religion, which is another good example of why it's not a religion. Typically, if someone participates, is a follower of a religion, they are a follower of that religion only. Typically, not universally, because I don't want to speak for every single person there is. But typically, that's something that we see. In Confucianism, it isn't. And so that's an important element to know. Taking a look at our next ethnic religion, this one takes it a step further, make it a little bit more challenging for us. All right, this is Taoism. Our definition: a Chinese value system and ethnic religion, emphasizing conformity to Tao, which translates to the way, consisting of proper form of political rule and on the oneness of humanity and nature. Now, because it is considered a religion by some and a value system by others, there is some debate in the academic community. And as a result, I think it might be a little less likely that we see this as a question on the AP exam. But, I could certainly see something like all of the following, but which are ethnic religions? And Taoism is included in that, and so is Buddhism, where there's clearly a right answer, and that in the writing of the AP readers, or AP test writers, I should say, they consider Taoism to be a ethnic religion. So there are ways that I could absolutely see it come across on the test with an opinion of the test writers, but it's a little bit more challenging. Right? There's no official founder or founding date, or there's no deity, but one of the individuals that we want to associate with Taoism is a man named Lao Tzu, who is a contemporary of Confucius. And it is during this time that Taoism begins its kind of rise. Some aspects focus on kind of the more mystical or magical elements of life and of nature and things like that. Because of that mystical and magical element of it, when the communists took power in China in 1949, Taoism was banned. And so many people had to either, one, flee China, and so it is still legal and practiced in Taiwan, where the Chinese nationalists fled after the communist takeover. It is still practiced in China, but the numbers are very, very small officially. Many scholars believe that the numbers are probably higher, but because it is still illegal, people aren't quite as open about it. Again, that makes it more challenging for us to define the exact numbers. And because it is illegal, many people practice it in kind of an underground fashion. They practice it whether in their homes and things like that. And so you're going to see a lot of different variations in practices and things like that as it relates to Taoism. And so there's not a central hierarchy like you might see with Catholicism or Mormonism. Instead, it's much more individualized, as it were. So let's take a look at some of the major aspects that are associated with Taoism. Tao is the way or the path, and one must travel the path. And there's a lot of emphasis on balance, because the three jewels are about balance. It's about compassion, it's about moderation, humility. So those are the three jewels that are typically associated with Taoism. And one of the very identifiable symbols of Taoism is yin and yang. And yin and yang are what the universe is made up of. And in order for the universe to exist, there must be balance. Too much of yin would be bad. Too much of yang would be bad. So I don't want you to think just because, if you look at it as black and white, as one is good and one is bad, it's not that. It's about balance. You need both sides of this. So I don't want you to think like one is good, one is bad. It's that there has to be balance here. Okay? And so, yin typically associated with the earth, while yang is the heavens, right? So the sky and earth. Yin is darkness, yang is light. Female, male, cold, hot, depth, height. Being passive versus being active. Death and life. Hey, none of it, it's not good versus evil. That's not what this is about. It's about the different elements that too much of one side would be bad. Doesn't matter which side. There has to be balance. And if you look at the symbol, if you look at the yin and yang symbol, there is balance. And it's in balance. And that's what Taoism is about, is walking that path, walking the way, and keeping life balanced as a result. Okay. Our next East Asian ethnic religion is Shintoism. And Shintoism is a polytheistic ethnic religion located in Japan and is related to Buddhism. Emphasis is placed on reverence of deities, of natural forces, and ancestor worship. So, the background, the origins. No single founder, but it's important to note that the forces of nature are considered divine. So, different elements in nature, whether it's the sun or the moon, rocks and trees and rivers, are considered divine or considered sacred. And as time went on, eventually the concepts of ancestor worship were brought into this. So deceased ancestors, deceased emperors became godlike in their worship and reverence. All right. Now, that's important to understand, because even though it says that this is a polytheistic religion, I've read different sources that say how many deities, how many gods there are. One resource said that there are two sides, and that everything else is godlike and working for one or the other side. And then others say that there are upwards of 8,000 different deities, and that as time goes on, those numbers change and increase and things like that. And so there is some disagreement about that. Regardless, though, there does seem to be agreement that it is polytheistic. As far as distribution goes, it is widely practiced in Japan, but it's something where some might have been labeled as Shintoists in the past, may not be practicing, things like that. So since it is, let's take a look. Holy sites, 80,000 different shrines throughout Japan. Each shrine an entrance to the shrine is typically denoted with the symbol that you see in the bottom right. It's actually a structure called the Torii Gate. And so each pagoda, which is a Shinto shrine, the entrance to that pagoda or that shrine is going to have a torii gate. And so as far as structure that is identifiable in the cultural landscape, one, the buildings themselves, like pagodas themselves, would be very identifiable. But the torii gate would not only be identifiable the fact that it is associated with Shintoism, but also the fact that it is something that we find in Japan. Okay. All right. The historical background of this, in the late 1800s, there was a shift, there was a change where Shintoism became the state religion of Japan. However, over time, that's very much been relaxed. And so now the emphasis is more on ritual rather than on the belief systems and things like that. It's more about like going through the steps. So what has ended up happening is that there's a crossover here, okay, that many people in Japan might identify as Shintoist or perform Shintoist rituals while also being Buddhists as well. And so this is something that makes it really kind of interesting. So let's take a look at that. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a couple different maps here. First off, let's ask the questions that we always ask. What type of map are we looking at? And what scale are we looking at? And this one's a little bit trickier, right? This one's a little bit tougher than usual. Yes, it's obviously a choropleth map, but what'd you say for scale? Hopefully you noticed that the boundary lines are drawn within a national unit, within a country, which means that is below the national scale. So we call those subnational units. Now, the subnational unit in Japan is referred to as prefectures. So this is the prefecture scale. If you wrote subnational scale, that works just fine. But this is the prefecture scale. Looking at the percentage of the population that identifies as Shinto, percent that identifies as Buddhist, and then let's take a closer look at this third map, the one on the far right. It says percent combined Shinto and Buddhist. All right. Now the darkest shade of red is above average Shinto and Buddhist. Then moving down, we have above average Shinto but below average Buddhist, below average Shinto, above average Buddhist, and then below average Shinto and Buddhist. Right? So this would be a really interesting map if we had, let's say, a geographic information system where we could layer these on top of one another. That's kind of what they've done, is that they took the percent Shinto map on the far left, the percent Buddhist map in the middle, layered them on top of one another, and then we're able to create a separate map looking at that. And so it's really kind of interesting to see that. So, real quick, I want you to, pose a question. Ask a question from this. When you take a look at this, what do you notice? What do you observe? Observations work just fine as well. If this were a map on an FRQ, what would be some of the things that you notice? What would be some of the things that you jot down and reference? What might be a question that you ask or that you have to come up with an answer to? All right, so take a moment, come up with some of those different types of things. All right, last ethnic religion for this particular chapter, for this particular lecture, is animism. Now, before we even start, here's our definition and then we'll elaborate on it. Belief that objects such as plants and stones or natural events like thunderstorms and earthquakes have a discrete spirit and conscious life. So it's important to understand that animism essentially means, a lot of times students think that animism deals with animals. It isn't quite like that. What it means is that things are animated. They are brought to life. Things that we would consider inanimate, like plants and stones or thunderstorms and earthquakes, are animated, that they have a life, they have a spirit. Now, it's important to understand that animism is practiced differently all over the world. All right. It really depends on the local culture, the local beliefs, things like that. So very much a good example of folk culture because it's largely tied to the local beliefs, and so the way that things are animated or the spirits that exist and how they interact with one another, largely going to be based on local beliefs. All right, and so you can see that there with the practices being passed down by oral tradition. It's not there's not a uniform system of animism across the world, and it's not confined to a specific one geographic area. It's not like Shintoism in Japan or Hinduism in India. It's not like that. All right, we're going to see animism practiced in Southeast Asia, in Africa, so different things like that. All right. There's some dispute about whether or not it is monotheistic, very kind of similar in the sense to Hinduism, because some scholars will say it is monotheistic, one supreme God with many assistants being the animated objects. Others will say that all those different spirits are different deities and thus polytheistic. So again, kind of a debate about that. As far as distribution goes, about 100 million people worldwide are considered animist. And again, there's not a uniform system of animism. It's going to be very, very localized. About 12% of Africa identifies or would be classified as animist. All right. Whereas to look at the expansion of universalizing religions in Africa, Africans about 46% Christian, 40% Muslim. All right. And those numbers are increasing because the number of animists are decreasing. In 1980, just 30 plus years ago, there were 200 million animists. Now it's been cut in half. All right, and that is largely due to the expansion of universalizing religions that are seeking converts through missionary work and things like that. And the highest numbers of animists currently are in countries in sub-Saharan Africa like Mozambique, Cameroon, Togo, Benin are countries where we would see the highest rate of animist followings. Next map, last map for tonight, is looking at just an example of a very diverse region of the world as far as religion is concerned, and that is Southeast Asia. Very diverse in terms of language, very diverse in forms of religion as well. So you can see here we have a choropleth map, national scale. Different choropleth classes represent different religions. So the orange is animism. The darker purple is Mahayana Buddhism. The lighter purple is Theravada Buddhism. Pink is Christianity. Yellow is Hinduism. Notice not a lot of Hinduism on here, but if you take a look down, very bottom of the map, in Indonesia, the island of Bali. We talked about that before. And then Islam is green. And so take a look at some of the different areas. You can see that especially a lot of interior areas are animist, very rural areas are animist, and you can see some elements of colonialism over time, the diffusion of universalizing religions over time, different branches of different religions. There's a lot going on here. So jot down some observations, jot down some reasons why things may be what they are. Talk about some of those different elements and point those out. Last slide for tonight, a couple basic definitions, so should be super quick. Elements that are associated with animism, all right? Definition, tribal religion, special forms of ethnic religions distinguished by their small size, unique identity, with localized culture groups not absorbed into modern society that often have close ties to nature. And typically that's associated with animism. They could be, very small sects of different religions, particularly ethnic religions, but typically associated with animism. And then shamanism. Shamanism is a set of beliefs and practices in some tribal religions based on the belief in a hidden world of gods, ancestral spirits, and demons responsive only to a shaman or interceding priest. Essentially what this means is that a shaman is an intermediary, is someone who can communicate with the spirits. And so they act as a go-between, as to use the term that's referenced in the definition, something that intercedes, is in between the spirits and us as mortals. And so that wraps up our discussion of ethnic religions, and we will pick up with our last lecture talking about the impact of these different religions. Have a wonderful night, everybody. I'll see you soon.